The mattress felt like a lie beneath her body. Keiko pressed her palms flat against its surface, testing its softness with the suspicious touch of someone who had learned not to trust comfort. The springs gave slightly under her weight, a gentle yielding that felt almost obscene after months of sleeping on bamboo mats and dirt floors. She sat on the edge, her feet barely touching the wooden floor of the barracks, and wondered if this too was some elaborate form of torture. Around her, 17 other women moved through the same ritual of disbelief. Some sat gingerly on their assigned beds, others remained standing, as though accepting the mattress would be an admission of defeat. The silence was thick with confusion. Outside, American guards walked their posts with the casual efficiency of men who saw nothing remarkable in providing prisoners with actual beds. The young woman next to Keiko, barely 18, ran her fingers along the rough wool blanket folded at the foot of the bed. "Is this real?" she whispered in Japanese, her voice so soft it barely disturbed the air. Her name was Emiko, and she had been a radio operator on Saipan before the island fell. Now she stared at the blanket, as though it were made of gold thread. Keiko had no answer. 3 days earlier, she had been certain she would die. The American planes had circled their position like hawks, and when the ground forces finally came, she had closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for her ancestors. Death would be swift, she had hoped. Death would be honorable. What she had not expected was this strange limbo, this place where enemies fed you soup and gave you beds. The barracks smelled of fresh wood and soap, alien scents that mingled uneasily with the familiar odors of fear and unwashed bodies. Through the windows, late afternoon light filtered in golden bars across the floor. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of construction, the rhythm of hammers building more structures like this one. The Americans, it seemed, were planning for their prisoners to stay alive for quite some time. A guard entered, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The women tensed, some jumping to their feet in the automatic posture of attention they had learned in their own military training. But the guard simply nodded, his expression neutral, and spoke in English. None of them understood the words, but his tone was matter-of-fact, almost bored. He gestured toward the beds, made a sleeping motion with his hands pressed together against his cheek, and left. Emiko looked at Keiko with wide eyes. Did he just give us permission to sleep? The concept was so foreign, it took several moments to process. In the Imperial Japanese forces, sleep was earned through exhaustion, taken in whatever corner could be found between duties. Permission to rest was not something that existed in their vocabulary. Yet here was an enemy soldier casually granting them what their own officers had always treated as weakness. As darkness fell, the women began the delicate negotiation with their beds. Some, unable to trust the softness, pulled their blankets onto the floor, recreating the familiar hardness they understood. Others lay down fully clothed, ready to spring up at the first sign of trouble. Keiko found herself somewhere in between, sitting on the mattress, but not quite ready to surrender to its comfort. The first night was a symphony of small sounds, the creak of springs as bodies shifted uncomfortably, the whisper of cotton sheets against skin that had known only rough fabric for months. Somewhere in the darkness, someone was crying very quietly, the sound muffled by a pillow. Whether the tears were from relief or despair, Keiko could not tell. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the propaganda films they had been shown during training. American prisoners of war were supposed to be beaten, starved, worked to death in labor camps. The images had been vivid, skeletal figures in rags, begging for scraps of food. Yet here she lay, her stomach full from the evening meal of beef stew and bread, her body cushioned by a mattress that was firmer than any she had slept on even at home. The contradiction was maddening. If the Americans were capable of such kindness to their prisoners, what did that say about the stories they had been told? What did it say about their own treatment of enemy captives? Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams that made no sense. She found herself in her family's house in Nagoya, but the walls were made of American canvas, and her mother was serving her rice in a metal tray like the ones used in the prisoner mess hall. She woke with a start, momentarily confused by the softness beneath her, the clean smell of laundered blankets. The morning brought another revelation. The beds were not temporary. The guards did not rouse them from sleep with shouts and blows. Instead, a bell rang somewhere in the camp, a gentle summons rather than a harsh command. Keiko opened her eyes to find pale sunlight streaming through the windows, and for a moment the simple act of waking naturally, without violence, felt like a miracle. At breakfast, they were given eggs. Real eggs, fried in butter, with toast and jam and coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. Keiko held the tin cup between her hands, feeling its warmth seep through her palms. Coffee had been a luxury even before the war, available only to the wealthy or on special occasions. Now her enemies served it to her every morning, as though it were no more precious than water. Emiko sat beside her, staring at her plate with the same bewildered expression that seemed to be permanently etched on all their faces. "My brother told me Americans eat meat for every meal," she said quietly. "I thought he was exaggerating." "Maybe he wasn't," Keiko replied, watching as guards filled their own plates from the same serving line. There was no separate, inferior food for prisoners, no ceremony of humiliation around meals. They simply ate together, captors and captives, sharing the same bacon, the same bread, the same bitter coffee. After breakfast came work assignments, but here too the Americans defied expectation. The work was not back-breaking labor in mines or fields, but simple tasks around the camp. Some women were assigned to help in the kitchens, learning to prepare the large meals that fed the entire compound. Others worked in the laundry, washing clothes in machines that seemed to run by magic, producing clean garments in a fraction of the time it would take by hand. Keiko was assigned to the camp infirmary, where she would assist the American medical staff. Her training as a nurse made her valuable, and the American doctor who interviewed her seemed genuinely pleased to have her help. Dr. Morrison was a tall, thin man with graying hair and gentle hands, who spoke slowly and used simple words when addressing her. He showed her around the medical facility, pointing to supplies and equipment with the pride of a man showing off his garden. The infirmary was better equipped than many hospitals she had seen in Japan. There were real surgical instruments, not the improvised tools they had learned to use when supplies ran low. There were medicines, bottles and bottles of them, lined up on shelves like soldiers in formation. Most shocking of all, there were beds with clean white sheets, waiting for any patient who might need them. "For prisoners?" she asked in her limited English, gesturing toward the beds. Dr. Morrison nodded, matter-of-factly. Of course, sick is sick. The simplicity of his response struck her like a physical blow. In her world, medical care was rationed according to usefulness, rank, and loyalty. Prisoners of war were not entitled to clean sheets or morphine for pain. Yet here was this enemy doctor, speaking of treating captives as though their suffering mattered just as much as anyone else's. Her first patient was another Japanese woman, one of the older prisoners who had developed a persistent cough. Keiko watched as Dr. Morrison examined her with the same care he would show to one of his own soldiers, listening to her lungs, checking her temperature, prescribing medicine without a moment's hesitation about the cost or the woman's worthiness. "She needs rest," he told Keiko, writing notes on a clipboard. "Make sure she gets extra portions at meals, and keep her warm." Extra portions. For a prisoner, for someone who, according to everything Keiko had been taught, deserved nothing but contempt. The doctor's casual compassion was more disorienting than any interrogation technique could have been. That night, lying on her mattress in the darkness, Keiko found herself thinking about her brother Hiroshi, who had been captured by the Americans somewhere in the Philippines. For months she had mourned him as dead, certain that enemy captivity meant slow starvation and daily beatings. Now, staring at the ceiling of her comfortable barracks, she allowed herself to wonder if perhaps he too was sleeping on a soft mattress, eating eggs for breakfast, being treated by doctors who saw illness as something to heal rather than ignore. The thought brought tears she did not expect. Not tears of grief, but something more complicated, a mixture of relief and guilt and confusion that had no name. If Hiroshi was alive, if he was being treated with the same inexplicable kindness she was experiencing, then she had spent months grieving unnecessarily. But it also meant that everything they had been told about the nature of war, about the character of their enemies, about the very meaning of honor itself, had been wrong. The days began to blur together in a routine that felt increasingly normal, increasingly comfortable. Wake to the gentle bell, breakfast of eggs and coffee, work in the infirmary, learning American medical techniques that were often superior to what she had been taught, lunch of soup and sandwiches, More work, reading time, sometimes even music in the evenings when one of the guards brought out a guitar. The mattresses became less shocking, then familiar, then necessary. Keiko found she could no longer imagine sleeping on the ground. Her body had adapted to softness with embarrassing speed, and she began to understand how quickly comfort could become a habit, how easily the human spirit could be seduced by simple kindness. Letters arrived from Japan, delivered by Red Cross representatives who treated the exchange like a sacred duty. Keiko's mother wrote of shortages, of hunger, of nights spent in air raid shelters listening to the drone of American planes overhead. The contrast between her mother's suffering and her own full belly was obscene, almost unbearable. How could she write back about eggs and coffee, and soft mattresses when her family was eating bark soup and sleeping on concrete floors? Yet she wrote anyway, because the truth demanded telling. She wrote carefully, knowing the letters would be censored, but she found ways to convey the basic impossibility of her situation. "I am well fed," she wrote. "The guards are not cruel, I sleep in a warm bed. I do not understand this war anymore." Other women struggled with the same contradictions. Emiko had received word that her father had died in an air raid on Tokyo, burned alive when his factory was bombed. Yet she continued to eat American food, to sleep on American sheets, to accept medical care from American doctors. The guilt was eating her alive, but the alternative, refusing the kindness, choosing to starve in solidarity, seemed equally impossible. "Are we betraying them by staying alive?" she asked Keiko one evening, as they sat outside the barracks, watching the sun set beyond the barbed wire. "Are we dishonoring our families by accepting this?" Keiko had no answer. The question was one that haunted all of them, a moral puzzle with no clear solution. They had been raised to believe that death before dishonor was the highest virtue, that suffering in service to the emperor was the purest form of love. Yet here they were, not dead, not suffering, not serving anyone except perhaps the American war effort by remaining healthy and cooperative. The interrogations when they came were nothing like what they had expected. No bright lights, no torture, no screaming demands for military secrets. Instead, intelligence officers sat across from them at plain wooden tables, offering cigarettes and asking polite questions about their units, their training, their experiences. The Americans seemed genuinely curious about Japanese military culture, asking about things like why soldiers would choose death over capture, how the concept of face operated in military hierarchies, what songs they had sung while marching. Keiko found herself answering more questions than she had intended, not because she was being coerced, but because the officers listened with what seemed like genuine interest. They took notes on her descriptions of Japanese field hospitals, asked detailed questions about medical training, wanted to know about supply lines and communication methods. It felt more like a scholarly interview than an interrogation, and she began to realize that the Americans were trying to understand their enemy rather than simply defeat them. The realization was profoundly unsettling. In her world, enemies were faceless, inhuman, deserving of nothing but destruction. The idea that one might try to understand an enemy, to see them as complex human beings with their own motivations and cultures, was foreign to the point of being almost incomprehensible. Yet here were American officers, who seemed genuinely interested in Japanese poetry, who asked about her family not to find weaknesses, but out of simple human curiosity. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came another shock: heating. The barracks were fitted with stoves that burned coal, keeping the interior warm even when snow piled against the windows. Keiko had spent the previous winter in a dugout on Saipan, wearing every piece of clothing she owned and still shivering through the night. Now she slept in cotton pajamas provided by the Red Cross, her body warm beneath wool blankets, her feet protected by thick socks that had been knitted by American volunteer organizations. The generosity was overwhelming, incomprehensible. Somewhere in America, women she had never met were knitting socks for Japanese prisoners of war. The thought kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling, and trying to understand the mentality that could see enemies as worthy of such care. Christmas brought its own revelations. The prisoners were invited to participate in a celebration that included music, extra food, and small gifts. Kiko received a package containing chocolate, soap, and a small wooden carving of a bird that one of the guards had made during his off-duty hours. She held the carving in her hands, running her fingers over the smooth wood, trying to comprehend the mind that would create something beautiful for a person he was supposed to hate. Emiko's gift was a book of American poetry, translated into Japanese by some thoughtful volunteer organization. She sat on her mattress that Christmas night, reading verses about snow and love and the beauty of ordinary moments, and Kiko could see her struggling with the same impossible questions that plagued them all. How could enemies write about love? How could people who dropped bombs on cities also create art about the sanctity of life? The new year brought changes to the camp. More prisoners arrived, including some men who had been captured in other Pacific battles. The stories they told were consistent with what the women had experienced: decent treatment, adequate food, medical care, even opportunities for education and recreation. One man, a former artillery officer, had learned to play chess from his American guards. Another had been given access to books on engineering, allowing him to continue studies that had been interrupted by the war. Each story was another thread pulling at the fabric of everything they had believed. If American captivity was consistently humane, then what did that say about Japanese captivity? If American guards played chess with their prisoners, what did that say about the nature of the enemy they had been taught to hate, without question? Dr. Morrison continued to amaze Keiko with his casual competence and humanity. He treated every patient, regardless of nationality, with the same professional care. When one of the Japanese prisoners developed appendicitis, he operated without hesitation, using the same techniques and taking the same precautions he would for an American soldier. The man recovered fully, his scar healing cleanly, and Keiko watched him gain weight and strength until he was healthier than he had been before his capture. "Why?" she asked Dr. Morrison one day as they cleaned instruments together. Her English had improved considerably during her months in the camp. "Why help enemy?" The doctor paused in his work, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because," he said finally, "sick people need help. That's what doctors do." The simplicity of his answer was maddening. In her world, everything had layers of complexity, hidden meanings, considerations of loyalty and honor and sacrifice. Yet here was this man, reducing the entire moral universe to a single principle: sick people need help. The clarity of it was almost violent in its contrast to the twisted logic she had been raised with. Spring arrived with a warmth that seemed to penetrate more than just the air. The windows of the barracks were opened, letting in fresh breezes that carried the scent of new grass and blooming flowers. Some of the prisoners were allowed to work in the camp gardens, planting vegetables and tending to flower beds that served no purpose except beauty. Kiko found herself assigned to the medical garden, where Dr. Morrison was growing herbs that could be used in treatments. Working with soil was a revelation. Her hands, which had spent months dealing with blood and bandages and the machinery of death, now coaxed life from earth. She watched seeds sprout, tended seedlings with careful attention, and felt something loosening inside her chest that she had not even realized was tight. The act of creation, of nurturing growth rather than managing destruction, felt like coming back to life after a long illness. The herbs grew with astonishing speed in the rich American soil. Medicinal plants that would have struggled in Japan's depleted earth flourished here, their leaves thick and green, their roots strong. Kiko began to understand that the abundance around her was not exceptional, not a special display put on for prisoners, but simply the normal state of things in this country. America was a place where the soil was rich, where supplies were plentiful, where comfort was assumed rather than earned. Letters from home became increasingly difficult to read. Her mother wrote of friends dying from malnutrition, of children so hungry they could barely walk to school, of old people freezing in their homes because there was no fuel for heat. The contrast with her own situation was becoming unbearable. She was gaining weight, her cheeks filling out, her body stronger than it had been in years. Meanwhile, her family was slowly starving. The guilt was physical, a weight in her chest that made it difficult to breathe. How could she accept kindness from people who were bombing her homeland? How could she sleep comfortably on soft mattresses while her mother shivered on a hard floor? Yet what was the alternative? Refusing food would not feed her family. Sleeping on the floor would not warm her mother. Her suffering would accomplish nothing except perhaps satisfying a sense of moral purity that was beginning to seem like a luxury she could not afford. Summer brought new freedoms. Prisoners were allowed to spend time outside during the day, to walk within certain designated areas of the camp, to sit in the shade of trees and read books from the camp library. Kiko often found herself on a bench near the medical garden, watching her herbs grow while reading American magazines that had been translated into Japanese. The magazines were another revelation. They contained articles about normal life, recipes, fashion, advice on raising children, reviews of movies and books. There were photographs of American families at picnics, of women in pretty dresses, of children playing in yards behind white houses with neat gardens. These were the people who were supposed to be her mortal enemies, yet they looked remarkably like people she might have known at home before the war changed everything. One photograph in particular haunted her, a young American nurse probably about her own age, standing in what looked like a hospital ward. The woman was smiling, her uniform crisp and white, her hands gentle on the shoulder of an elderly patient. Kiko stared at the image for a long time, seeing herself reflected in this enemy woman's face. They had the same job, the same training, the same instinct to heal rather than harm. How could two people so similar be required to hate each other simply because they had been born on different sides of an ocean? The interrogations continued, but they had evolved into something more like conversations. The American intelligence officers seemed less interested in extracting military secrets than in understanding the cultural forces that had created such dedicated soldiers. They asked about education in Japan, about the role of the emperor, about how young people learned to accept death as preferable to dishonor. Kiko found herself trying to explain concepts that had once seemed self-evident but now felt increasingly foreign even to her. How could she describe Bushido to men who treated their prisoners with casual kindness? How could she explain the shame of capture to people who seemed to see imprisonment as simply an unfortunate circumstance of war, rather than a moral failing? "Do you still believe death is preferable to dishonor?" one officer asked, during a late summer session. He was a young man, probably a recent college graduate, with intelligent eyes and a genuine curiosity about the world beyond his own experience. Kiko considered the question carefully. 6 months earlier, the answer would have been immediate and certain. Now, sitting in a comfortable chair, her stomach full of good food, her body healthy and strong, the question seemed more complex. "I don't know," she said finally. "Maybe dishonor is not the same thing I thought it was." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. If dishonor was not what she had thought, then what was honor? If capture did not automatically mean shame, then what did it mean to serve one's country? The questions multiplied like rabbits, each answer breeding 2 new uncertainties, until she felt lost in a maze of doubt that had no clear exit. Fall brought rumors that the war was not going well for Japan. The prisoners were not given detailed information, but they could sense changes in the atmosphere of the camp, a tension among the guards that had not been there before. Some of the American staff seemed more somber, more focused, as though something significant was approaching. Then came the morning when Dr. Morrison arrived at the infirmary, with tears in his eyes. He gathered the medical staff, including Kiko and the other Japanese assistants, and spoke in simple words that everyone could understand. "The war is over," he said. "Japan has surrendered." The silence that followed was profound, complete, as though the entire world had stopped breathing. Kiko felt the words hit her like physical blows, each syllable striking a different part of her body. Surrender. The word that had been unthinkable, impossible, the ultimate shame that was worse than death itself. Yet she was still alive to hear it. They were all still alive, healthy, well-fed, cared for by enemies who had proven themselves capable of extraordinary grace. If this was dishonor, if this was the shame worse than death, then why did she feel more fully human than she had in years? The days after surrender were strange, suspended between one world and another. The prisoners were told they would eventually be repatriated, returned to Japan to rebuild their lives in whatever remained of their homeland. But for now, they continued their routines: meals in the mess hall, work assignments, evening recreation, sleep on soft mattresses that no longer seemed like lies. Kiko spent her time in the medical garden, tending to herbs that would soon be harvested by someone else. The work felt like a meditation, a way of processing the magnitude of everything that had changed. Her hands moved automatically, weeding and watering, while her mind struggled to understand what it would mean to return to a Japan that had surrendered, a country where the emperor himself had admitted defeat. What would she tell her family about her experience? How could she describe the kindness of enemies, the comfort of captivity, the strange mercy that had kept her alive when she had been prepared to die? How could she explain that the Americans had treated her better than her own officers ever had, that she had learned more about medicine from Dr. Morrison than from any Japanese instructor? The questions had no easy answers, but they no longer felt like weights dragging her down. Instead, they felt like doors, openings to possibilities she had never imagined. If enemies could be kind, then perhaps the world was more complex than she had been taught. If surrender did not automatically mean dishonor, then perhaps survival itself was a form of victory. On her last night in the camp, Kiko lay on her mattress and tried to memorize the sensation of comfort. The softness beneath her body, the warmth of clean blankets, the security of walls that kept out the cold without keeping out hope. Tomorrow she would begin the journey home, carrying with her not just the physical strength that American food had given her, but something more precious, the knowledge that the world was wider, stranger, and more merciful than anyone had told her. The mattress had been a lie, but not the kind she had first imagined. It had not been a trick or a trap or a form of torture. Instead, it had been a lie about what enemies were supposed to be, about what war was supposed to mean, about what human beings owed to each other, even in the midst of the most brutal conflicts. It had been a soft, comfortable lie that revealed harder, more complex truths about the nature of mercy and the possibility of grace, even in the darkest times. As she drifted off to sleep for the last time in the American camp, Kiko thought about all the other women who would never know what she had learned, that sometimes the enemy's greatest weapon is not cruelty, but kindness, that sometimes the most subversive act is not resistance, but simple human decency, that sometimes the lie that changes everything is not a harsh truth, but an impossible comfort, that proves the world is not as simple as anyone wants it to be. The mattress beneath her body was soft, forgiving, real, and in the morning, she would carry its memory home.